Hey, welcome back. We're here with Mr. Scot Ginsburg, and he's the author of It's Not All About the Rent, a tenant's guide to cracking the commercial real estate lease code. Now, Scott has over 2 decades of professional experience, and especially with tenants, buyers, but never in all aspects of their real estate needs. And Scott has supported more than 2,000 clients with these commercial real estate needs, and he's all about understanding your unique requirements and helping your company just navigate everything that goes into commercial real estate. We're talking about things like assessing your needs, calculating the true cost of your next lease, build a team of expert advisors, spot the landmines. And so Scott is going to fill us in on his book, maybe some repeats of what's in the book or some things that are left out. But overall, you'll get to know Scott. You'll get to know some of these things to do and not to do when it comes to commercial real estate and understanding that lease code. So, Scott, glad to be speaking with you.
Likewise. Thanks for having me, Robert. I appreciate it.
And I appreciate you too. And so we introduced you a little bit, hyped up the audience, so to speak. But in your own words, like what makes you really unique and stand out? What gets you excited?
Yeah, so I've been doing this about 25 years, exclusively representing tenants, never landlords, including my firm, Hughes Marino, in all their real estate needs, whether they're looking to find their first space, expand and relocate, downsize, or even renew a lease, because a renewal is by far the most profitable for any landlord. The landlord doesn't suffer downtime. The landlord typically doesn't have to refurbish the space completely for a new tenant. And obviously tenants, 70% of the time, they renew, and landlords know this. So already you have an underdog situation. And the way that I got into the business and kind of had a passion for it was in the 90s when the internet came about. Myself and a partner and I had started our own company, and the agent that I employed to help find and negotiate the first office lease represented both landlords and tenants. And oftentimes tenants are not looked as a repeat customer because they're only doing a real estate lease once every 3, 5, 7, 10 years. They're amateurs. They're not doing it every day. Landlords typically don't own one property. They own a building with multiple suites or multiple buildings with multiple suites. And so the more tenants that the agent brings to a particular property for the landlord, that agent oftentimes will try to obtain the listing, to lease the building, to sell it. And so really the landlord is traditionally seen as the repeat customer. After seeing this and having negotiated it myself and just going through a massive amount of pitfalls, I'm like, So years later, when obviously the company just winded down, I always had a passion for real estate. And when I got into the business, I was deciding what to do. And somebody explained it to me. You can represent landlords, you can do apartments, you can do industrial, residential. And somebody said tenant representation. And that just rang a bell in my head because of the underdog situation and how unrepresented most companies are going into the process.
I love it. And I think you're so right that this is not talked about enough, right? When they talk about just in general, right? You look at the books that are out there and the YouTube videos, at least me as a layperson, you see a lot of how to navigate the landlording aspect. But if you're some company and you're like looking at like different spaces or looking to like get the best bang for your buck or prosper and grow and just like navigate against this landlord where everybody wins, it seems like there needs to be more help about the underdog, right? These businesses like navigating these sorts of spaces. And so, and I also like you mentioned in your book there, I noticed there was a lot of kind of focus on this idea of, well, extending the lease early or like kind of like using the positive of the staying in longer and long-term relationships to get a little bit of a break with the landlord. So it seems like it doesn't necessarily have to be about like, well, let me get like the best deal or let me like kind of like screw over my landlord. It's like a situation where everybody wins, everyone's happy.
Yeah, 100%. And while most of the time it's a win-win situation, or at least both parties walk away feeling good, it is a game where the devils are in the details, hands down. To your point, where you mentioned in my book about you can extend the lease early, this is extraordinarily prevalent right now today, We're in an awkward time in the economy where interest rates are at an all-time high in the past several decades. We have trillions of dollars of commercial real estate debt that are coming due from landlords that own all types of real estate, office buildings, laboratory buildings, industrial, apartments, you name it, right? And what landlords obviously don't want to do is have a future vacancy. And so oftentimes, think of it like a home refinance. If you entered a home finance situation at 6% and rates drop to 4%, you can go to the lender and refinance and drop your mortgage payments. Simple. Think of it, to your point, you call it a lease restructure, a recast, a blend and extend, all the same. And the situation is such that if a company is number one, 50% or more through their lease term, in other words, if they're at month 30 on a 60-month lease, if they're paying above market in rent, or they might have excess space, and the company has a decent financial history, meaning the landlord knows the tenant can pay the rent, all too often the landlord is willing to take a hit for the last 30 months or maybe the last 20 months, a year and a half, and either reduce the rent, shed extra square footage off in exchange for the tenant extending the lease term by 2, 3, 4, 5 years. In other words, if a company has a lease coming up in 26, the landlord might restructure it starting January of 2025, reducing the square footage and or rent, and that new lease would start 25 instead of at the end of 26 and might expire through 2029. Here's the key though. Doing it in an isolation and just going to the landlord and negotiating this, you must understand one thing. This is a pro-am matchup. And not to say all landlords are bad, but at the end of the day, just like tenants, both parties are serving the best interests of their respective companies, right? So it's important, whether you don't hire me, but you have a tenant advocate who's not representing landlords to aid in that negotiation. While you can't threaten the move, hey, I'm landlord, I'm going to move out. In certain circumstances, like we're in today, you have other landlords that are competing for tenants' vacancies where they might offer to move you into a new building and give you a year free rent. And that might be, as one example, a lever you can drive towards helping the renegotiation or restructuring of an early lease renewal.
This is great just to know that these sorts of strategies are available to us, right? To have this proactive mindset and maybe thinking outside the box and sometimes saying, well, there's, like you said, there's these landlords where they're like the future might be somewhat uncertain and they want to keep those buildings occupied. And so knowing some of this by planning a little bit ahead and by saying, well, hey, I could approach with this offer and get this better deal, get this better rate, it can be exciting, right? As long as you are deliberate about it and kind of like focused and have the numbers. And you mentioned a lot here about, you say, well, you could do this, and this is called this exact term. And so it's good to be educated in this way, as far as, someone might be saying, well, I've got this business, I've got this laboratory, I want to focus on running the business, but then this whole aspect here of the property and where you exist, like that's very important, right? And you can really increase your profits, cut your costs down by knowing some of these options that are available to you. And so, do you ever come across these companies that you help? Do they ever have trouble like getting into this mindset that you're in? Because I love how you say, like, sometimes you say things like, well, when you're approaching the landlord, like talk to other landlords, but the timing is important, right? Like I know in your book you say, like, don't wait until you have like a month or two left, because now like you're at a disadvantage. And so as far as like playing this chess game, do the companies you help like need educating to kind of get them to think like you, or like, how can we get into this mindset that you're in as far as the strategy?
That's a great question. In all honesty, one of the biggest challenges for a lot of companies to understand. And while certain circumstances might not afford a situation where the tenant can restructure the lease early or renew it or do some type of transaction, in terms of maybe they're going to sell the company, maybe they need funding. Obviously, money in the bank is first before you negotiate any type of transaction, including real estate. But in most circumstances, you're going to be shocked. As I mentioned before, 70% of tenants stay in their existing space at least once upon the expiration of the term. More so, the vast majority of tenants don't ride their lease term all the way through expiration. They might expand early, they might downsize early, they might move early, they might have to restructure the lease, they might have to do improvements to the space. There's typically some type of real estate transactional event that will occur before the end of the lease term. And while most companies typically just won't have the mindset unless there are massive pain points, such as we're busting at the seams or we're paying way too much in rent and it's just overwhelming, real estate, unfortunately, kind of falls down the line of the totem pole. It's not a proactive measure. And I see this with even large corporate clients that I work with on occasion, where I might be working with the real estate department, and the real estate department might have a bit of a challenge bubbling it up to upper management to get them to focus on reducing cost structure, helping them right size, right? Post COVID, we're all, nobody's occupying the amount of space that they did pre COVID, with the exception of very few. And it really takes a mindset. At the end of the day, you need to assess your real estate every single year, every 12 months. Are you above market? Are you below market? Do you have too much space? Is the landlord charging you too much for the operating expenses? We can get into that in a second. That's above and beyond what rent is due. And so there's certain triggers where you're always searching to see if you can improve the cost structure and or operational efficiency of the space. No different than a company is looking to basically reduce headcount, increase profit margins, reduce operating costs. Well, real estate is an operating cost, right? And there are certain levers, and oftentimes you might not be able to do anything, but it's important to assess that to see if there might be an opportunity to reassess, reevaluate, and potentially negotiate something to increase savings.
That's helpful. That's powerful. And there's definitely value in, on a recurring basis, just looking at, are you in this right size, and in all these different ways that you're explaining, right? The operating cost, the head count, your location, your space. And I also like how you say at the end there, how, well, even if you do examine some of these things and you say, well, hey, we are not in a position to change right now or don't need to change, at least you looked at it. Because it seems like when these businesses fail, or when people like drop the ball, it's because they're not paying attention, right? And they're hanging on to the past and trying to ride the momentum and just not being aware of what the current reality is. I mean, imagine if you didn't look at your finances for more than a few months, it'd be a complete disaster. And so that's
Right.
I think a really cool mindset to be in, is saying like, well, what's the right size? Am I in the right size? And then have the discipline to every year just re-examine this and say, well, what sort of levers can we pull in order to just kind of like maximize things and make sure that we keep the ship on the right path and make sure that our opportunities are still there and we don't back ourselves into a corner. And so you mentioned there about your landlord kind of having your operating costs higher than they should be. And so that's interesting. Can you explain that? Because I'm curious about some of the ways that tenants might be going wrong here without even realizing it.
Yeah. So great question. So there are multiple different types of leases. Some leases will have the rent, an arbitrary number. It's $3 per square foot per month. Sometimes that $3 per square foot per month will include building operating expenses, the landlord's building operating expenses. And there's three. There's property tax to any state. There's building insurance, not the interior, but the building itself. And then there's maintenance for the roof, maintenance for parking, maintenance for common electric in the parking lot, etc. Right? Within that $3, sometimes those costs are baked in. Some leases, they're exclusive. But without going into the mechanics, every year, the landlord does a true up, right? Property tax typically increases a couple percentage points each year in every state. We all know insurance costs have gone up, right? And typically maintenance costs go up. Why? Post-COVID, labor costs have gone up, supplies have gone up. And so every year they do what's called a reconciliation or a true up. And from that true up period in time, looking back at the prior 12 months, the landlord, one of three things might say, hey, it actually only cost us $100,000 to maintain the building. Great. We predicted $100,000. You owe us nothing. They might say it cost us $90,000. It's less. And in the event you let's say take up 10% of the building, you might get a check for $9,000 back. But guess what mostly happens? Whoa, it's $110,000. It's 10% more. And you basically take, I said 9,000, should be 900. So let's say it's $10,000 more. Well, that $10,000 is passed through to all the tenants. And if you take up 10% of the space, you are going to be liable for $1,000. And more often than not, these true-up costs compound year over year, and they increasingly get passed through to tenants. While there is no way to get out of it in its entirety, it's hyper important to understand what they currently are, have an accurate forecast of what they will be in the future, and then last but not least, and most important, is when you negotiate the lease, ensure that the landlord is not passing through items in the operating expenses that they should not be. In other words, it should just be to the building. The landlord can't pass through executive wages. They can't pass their leased car through. I'm giving you stuff I've seen in my 25 years. And these things are just vitally important to negotiate in the operating expense provision. I will say this. People don't really understand this a lot, but everybody's familiar with renting an apartment or renting a house. Those laws that govern tenants and landlords in the residential space, there are specific laws outside of the contract in most states. However, a commercial contract for a lease, the tenant is classified as sophisticated, but most often they're not. So whatever is bound in the lease, late fees of 8,000%, or the landlord could pass through his gold-plated sink. I'm being facetious here. Whatever's in the contract, you live by. And oftentimes, I'm giving you facetious examples, there are certain things that should not be passed through that absolutely cause detriment and cost burdens to the tenant.
And we need to know these things, right? And it's great to be immersed in this somewhat because there is a lot to navigate, and you have seen it all, and you have seen some of these landlords kind of put such and such in the lease, in the wordage, so that way they can come out a little bit ahead. And so it's like if they're playing the game, then you need to be playing the game as well. And so in these last few minutes here, I'm hoping that you can share a fun story with us because, like you said, you've been doing this for over 20 years. You've seen some things, and it's helpful, especially in a podcast session, now that you've given us all these things to think about, to hear a story about how you really helped someone, right? You helped one of these clients, and you use your expertise to kind of turn things around. So what comes to mind as far as a fun kind of before and after story of you applying your expertise?
Yeah, I think one really interesting story, it was a huge win for a customer. This is quite relevant in today's time. So during the COVID era of 20 through 21, where biotechnology funding just went skyrocketing, and there's three main metro areas in the U.S. that host predominantly the most biotechnology space: Southern California, Northern California, and Boston. There are others, but those are considered the three main hubs. Those markets just blew up, meaning biotechnology companies leased all of the existing space, and then landlords developed more. And then when the funding got shut off in 22, late 21, all of these buildings now are sitting vacant, coupled with the unfortunate fact that a lot of biotech companies are hanging on by a thread and they might not make it. A lot of them have gone under already. So to level set that just for a second, we had a customer that overcommitted by about 5 times the amount of square footage that they were in. They were in about 60,000 square feet. They needed 10,000 square feet. The company had roughly 5 months remaining in cash. All right. And that was it. The lease liability was absolutely causing detriment as it relates to an ongoing monthly reoccurring operational cost. All right. And The company was seeking funding to sustain its life and keep going. Well, it couldn't do that with the small amount of funding that it was due to receive with a massive lease obligation of several hundred thousand a month. So the strategy was deployed such that we were able to negotiate with the existing landlord to negotiate terminating roughly 40,000 of the 50,000 square feet 8 years in advance, condition upon the funding. So the landlord took the hit, not the tenant. Now the tenant has another 8 years left on the lease. So they basically shed a massive portion of their operating expense month in and month out. The alternative, if the landlord, some landlords will not do this, but the landlord took the bet. In other words, if the situation did not change, it was 100% certain the company was going to go under, the landlord was going to get 100% of the 50,000 square feet back. But instead, they took the bet to restructure the existing lease, terminate, so the tenant can find another day and receive its funding. These are some of the transactions and negotiations that we have deployed and have been successful at. We've done a handful of them just this year alone in similar fashion in the biotechnology space so that companies can still thrive and, like I said before, live another day. It is very prevalent in today's times as we're extremely uncertain how the next 12 months are going to take us.
That's amazing. You save companies here, and a lot of what you're mentioning here are just the kind of these tidal wave forces of the market happening, right? You mentioned about how like interest rates going up, or like funding drying up, or like all these major ups and downs. And so I can definitely see how if a company has this space and there's just like wild swings in even in just in their industry in particular, and then wondering like, oh no, we're totally screwed. We don't know what to do. The company's going to go under. How they can turn to someone like you and just get educated and get help from you and pursue these alternative avenues to, as you said, find another day and like restructure things. And so, what are some next steps here? If someone wants to know about your excellent book or about your company and you as a person, like how does somebody know if they're a right fit for your services and your book, and what are those services?
Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn. I'm a huge LinkedIn user. So my name is Scot Ginsburg, Scott with one T, Ginsburg with a U. Feel free to contact me there. I'm happy to educate. And to your point, Robert, we're not a fit for everybody. In doing this for 25 years, all I have is my time, just like executives that I work with. And the reality of it is I can assess a situation in 5 or 10 minutes and say, you know what, we can't help you. In fact, I just helped a future client last week where in reality, we just helped them extend the lease by a short term at a dramatically reduced rate. So technically they weren't a fit now, but obviously we built some goodwill in hopes of working for the customer in the future. I mean, who doesn't want more customers? We want them, you want them, everybody wants them. And so the reality of it is giving the best honest advice is the most important. And that doesn't always mean earning a fee or a commission from day one. It might be earning a fee or commission 3-4 years down the line. Not everything's what we call commissionable event at the end of the day. It's really about assessing the current situation, understanding the leverage that a tenant may have, whether perceived or real, if there is any, and then trying to deploy those certain tactics and strategies to negotiate the best possible outcome at the end of the day. And sometimes you're right. There's nothing you can do. I've walked away multiple times from meetings and just say, I would love to do another deal right now, but you have an awesome rental rate. Enjoy it. Write it out. I'd love to help you, but I can't. I'd be blowing smoke. So I'm just a complete straight shooter. And while some people always think you're selling them a service and there's always going to be a fee and a big pitch, in reality, I'm qualifying just like they're qualifying me because I can't help everybody. That's just the nature of the beast.
That's great logic, and I love the negotiating mindset here. Of sometimes it's time to walk away, or nothing can be changed about the deal, or other times like some kind of agreement can be made. Like I give you this, you give me that, and then everybody wins, and everyone prospers. Especially these landlords who, as you said, with that 70% statistic, like they want to keep the space filled, and a lot of the tenants they will stay in the space, and so there's sometimes a way to make that happen. And so you said Scot Ginsburg Scott with one T, Ginsburg with a U on LinkedIn. And then the website is It's Not All About the Rent. I'm sorry, the book. It's Not All About the Rent, A Tenant's Guide to Cracking the Commercial Real Estate Lease Code on Amazon and Audible. And then as far as the website, I know you work at Hughes Marino. So how does someone find information if they want to browse a website?
Yeah, so Hughes Marino, we're a national firm that exclusively represents tenants and or buyers who desire to purchase real estate and occupy it, not on an investment basis. And it's Hughes Marino, HUGHESMARINO.com. And the services that we employ, we are a firm that only represents tenants, as I mentioned, but think of us as a corporate outsourced real estate arm. In other words, while we do have brokerage, we are brokers. Our job is to transact and negotiate. Here is the one differentiating thing that no other firm has. We have a vertically integrated model that is a one-stop shop to the tenant. So in other words, we have in-house space planning that helps with the needs assessment in terms of the square footage that a company may need now and in the future. We have a construction and project management team that helps with the timeline, budgets, and manage those improvements. We also have financial analysts, in-house legal counsel, because lease contracts need to be reviewed by an attorney, as well as architects to help with space planning, pricing, permits. And then last but not least, a whole department dedicated towards lease audits as it relates to the operating expenses that are reconciled year in and year out. And these services are somewhat unique, or are unique to us, I should say, in terms of my firm, because leveraging all of these vertically integrated services, at the end of the day, it really allows us to do a better job than our competitors, given that we are not outsourcing everything.
Wonderful. I like the one-stop shop concept. And also, as you mentioned earlier, the kind of giving mindset. I'm saying like, hey, let's just have a conversation, look at your situation, tell you what I think. And so there's no harm in making that phone call and having that meeting and sending that message on LinkedIn. If you're a commercial real estate tenant or a buyer and you want to be a future tenant, then contact Scot Ginsburg from Hughes Marino. He's the executive managing director, and he'll help you with tenant and buyer representation, lease renewals, restructures, workouts, relocations, expansions, and contractions. So Scot Ginsburg, HughesMarino.com, and It's Not All About the Rent is the book. And so as people are checking out those next steps here, Scott, it's time to put you on the spot a slight bit to stump you, because I'd like to ask my guest about a fun quote or lesson that has helped them in their life and business journey that can help us. So what comes to mind for you as far as a fun quote or lesson?
You know what? I've given a lot of seminars over the years, and a really simple one is, if you don't ask, you don't get. What I mean by this, all right, right now, the real estate market is in price discovery mode. It's in free fall in a lot of markets. Laboratory space, industrial space is overbuilt. Landlords want to look in the past and hold on to the rent, right? And over time, as supply increases, simple economics 101, that will slowly press and push rents down, right? And while certain situations will, well, let me back up. I'll restart there. Oversupply will push rents down. Well, when you're in price discovery mode, nobody wants to chase the rental rate down if you're a landlord and owning real estate. Obviously, tenants do. But there are, aside from the rent, which is why I wrote the book and titled it called It's Not All About the Rent, because you might think you have a great rent, but your lease just sucks and you're going to get overcharged for everything under the sun. It's important to understand, or at least ask, if you can negotiate early terminations that weren't prevalent in the market a couple of years ago, expansion options years ago, right? You weren't able to get free rent a couple of years ago. Now you can get 1 month or 2 months of free rent. You might not be able to get signage years. So anything that you might think you need, too small, too big, you might think it's hilarious. If you don't ask for it, you're just simply not going to get it. And it's amazing how many people don't kind of think about the strategy as it relates to incorporating certain items in the lease to make it more flexible and congruent with the business needs.
Okay, and so thank you for educating us and telling us what's possible. You reminded me, like, I have a family member once who negotiated a car down to like, is there gas in the tank or not when he bought the car, and I thought that was just an amazing skill to have to like just ask for some of these things, and that's a great insight there. If you might think you have a great rent, but you have your lease sucks and everything about it, and so there might be things that you can do to sweeten the deal. So let's check it out. And if you're someone who can benefit from Scott's expertise, find him on LinkedIn, send that message. Scot Ginsburg, it's not all about the rent. Wonderful speaking with you.
Likewise. Thanks, Robert. I really appreciate it.